it is my pleasure to introduce Anna Mackenzie. Anna is a fantastic scholar. She's a postdoctoral researcher here at Lancaster University, and she's also employed as the deputy head of events here at uni. And Anna has done really remarkable work with the Hidden Academic Network, which actually she founded. And this is basically advancing the integration of research active staff in professional services and also other precarious roles within universities. So thank you so much, Anna, for that work that I think is really important. But in addition to that, she has published quite a bit on gender and genre in Shakespeare and Death. And she has been working on really exciting digital humanities projects, looking at mapping the text of Harry Potter and what is the role of a space on this kind of literature, which is the topic that she's presenting today, but also there are great series in media such as Doctor Who. And her latest and really exciting research, which I actually hope to hear more about also here in the Hangouts in the future, is a project that she's developing on the role of literature, but particularly fantasy in mental health. So watch this space. So regarding just the technical bit, as always, please feel free to use the chat as you want and present your questions to Anna there, which she will be addressing at the end in the Q&A session. But just to make her life easy, can I ask you to please insert the word question in capital letters at the beginning of your questions so she can actually find them easily in the Q&A session, please. Okay, so that's enough for me. Back to you, Anna. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Patty, for that really kind introduction. It's fab to be here at today's Digital Humanities Hangout. Again, huge thanks to Patty and to other colleagues from different institutions for setting up this amazing initiative in these really, really strange times. So Patty, as Patty mentioned, my name's Anna Mackenzie. I gained my PhD in gender and genre in Shakespeare's works from the University of Chester in 2015. And I work at Lancaster University as Deputy Head of Events, and that leads the team that works on corporate ceremonial and public events while continuing to research and publish, which does kind of beg the question, what do you do with a PhD in Shakespeare? You work in events management, clearly. So I'm going to talk a bit about a project that Patty and I set up together back in our Chester days, and I have some preliminary results and some thoughts to share with you. So the case study I'm going to talk about today is part of a larger project entitled Mapping Intangible Places towards the analysis of vague and imaginary space in literary fiction with spatial and digital technologies. The project as a whole works to develop methodologies and computational approaches for the analysis of how space and place are used in fantasy literature. And we've got a few research questions which are on the slide here. So they include, what is the role of place and space in recent and contemporary, and I define that as 19th to 21st century fantasy literary narrative? How does the construction and or use of specific places, spaces and landscapes mirror or contrast characters, storylines and plots? How does our understanding of space change over time, influencing the way in which we portray real, vague and imaginary space? And where the primary world is incorporated, how is this balanced alongside the fantastical places and spaces? So we've started with the Harry Potter novels as a pilot study, mainly because we love them, to test out our methodologies and make sure that we're comfortable with the analytic processes and how we set it all up. Then we hope to branch out to include some other fantasy works from 19th to 21st centuries. So I'm going to be talking a bit about digital humanities context, the methodologies, and discussing some of the content from the novels themselves. I am coming at this from a literary perspective. I'm not brilliant on the technical side of things. I kind of know enough to work on the project, but it is very much kind of an ongoing process of discovery for me, and it's one that I'm really enjoying. So thinking about it from a literary perspective, why is something like digital humanities research of interest to literary people? So for many, many years, literary scholars have debated the role of the physical text, whether it should be privileged over other forms, and what, in inverted commas, the text means and offers to our contemporary society. There has been a slight reluctance to consider the digital text and digital processes for analyses, which does result in a fairly untapped area of scholarship for literary studies. So some existing projects and previous research demonstrates that literary scholars might not as yet have fully embraced the digital technologies. Heading up digital humanities projects are primarily archaeologists, historians, and geographers. Addressing the balance between digital and physical text from a literary perspective should aid the discipline moving forwards. Sensitively might enable more literary scholars to realise the massive potential in digital approaches to literature. And yeah, the potential is amazing and it's very exciting. So just before I start talking about place, I thought it might be useful to quickly define my position on some of the key terms, primarily place and space, and the distinctions between them. So two writers, Robert Proussel and Lynn Meskel, talked about the post-spatial term, quote, space, as, quote, the physical setting in which everything occurs, unquote, and place, quote, the outcome of the social process of valuing space, end quote. So place is both this ideological and material location created from the processes of humanization, reflecting, for instance, a particular human purpose or desire, and developed by social groupings such as institutions. Of course, both concepts are pretty much now subject to the inevitable commodification and desire for profitability, but these social aspects and connections within these places and spaces remain. So humanities fields, they've long been fascinated by and compelled to investigate place and space. And this is simply because human existence and action is embedded in its geographies. There's no event without a place, and there's no place without an event. I have to hold my hands up there and say that's a line from Patty. I did not create that. I think it's gorgeous. I think it's very apt. Just that shout out there. So disciplines like history and archaeology have always looked to explain the attitudes, ideas and perceptions of spaces and places. With the so-called spatial term, literary geographies have increased and they're looking to analyse the role of place in literature and its relevance. So we are, as humanities scholars, increasingly looking for ways of creating new understanding and exposing new meanings from the sources of data that we use. I know using data to describe literature and text is a little bit of a controversial thing. So yeah, as many fields in the humanities, the data that we're managing takes the form of textual sources or the collections. In more recent years, digital humanities has developed as a field at the intersection between the computational approaches and theories and methods from the humanities themselves. So an example of this is the use of geographic information systems, software created within environmental sciences that has become fairly ubiquitous with Google Earth and Google Maps as light forms of GIS, to investigate the geographies mentioned in historical documents and corpora. The use of spatial technologies in the humanities has since led to the development of a subfield within digital humanities called spatial humanities. Excuse me. So it's looking not only to create novel ways to investigate space and place in historical and literary data, but also aiming to develop approaches that allow us to identify, extract, cross-link and reference this data in a semi or fully automated way through computational techniques. In adopting big data approaches such as text mining, we can expedite the search for data within very large collections of literature or texts of historical or archaeological interest. So the reason why this is important is because there is increasing accessibility to large digital collections of textual material that we can investigate at this large scale and look for patterns or pose questions that were just impossible to ask before. At that scale, it just would have taken about 1,000 years. For example, through new approaches and techniques using corpus linguistics and natural language processing, a computer can automatically identify named entities such as places, names, dates across thousands of books, which is amazing. As part of the approaches, methodologies such as geographical text analysis have emerged in the last few years using a combination between text mining and geographic information systems, allowing the identification and mapping of places mentioned in corpora. And this has produced some really awesome new discoveries, as the methodology enables this bird's eye view of geographic data mentioned in textual material. This approach, however, and this is particularly relevant for what I'm going to talk about, has the real limitation that it's capable of only identifying places that can be regarded as real, in that they can be accurately located by their coordinates on a map. So this is really problematic in the case of literature and sometimes history, since there can be references to vague and imaginary space. For example, the forest can be a real place, but without knowing which forest we're referring to, we cannot map it, and therefore it can be considered vague. Camelot as well can be seen as simply allegorical and therefore impossible to map. One of the most overlooked challenges and, excuse the pun, uncharted areas in the spatial humanities remains the large body of narratives featuring unmappable places, which are geographically vague or imaginary, or coalesce with or within real-world locations, which is where our project comes in, so enter fantasy. And fantasy presents an awesome challenge for place and space particularly, in looking for a way to create a more holistic approach for the analysis of space and place. We created a methodology that aimed firstly to identify in a more nuanced way the complexity of space and place in corpora, and secondly that would allow us to explore these places in connection to actions and people, among many other things. The spaces and places within the Harry Potter series beautifully mirror and sometimes contrast the growth of the eponymous character and his social circle. Harry is immediately set up on the first page as occupying a liminal space on the cusp of identity changes and developments. So as readers, our first physical glimpse of Harry is after Hagrid disembarks the magical motorbike, revealing Harry to be within a bundle of blankets. Dumbledore, quote, stepped over the low garden wall and walked to the front door. He laid Harry gently on the doorstep, end quote. The liminal language contained within just these 2 pages effectively sets up the baby Harry as in this really in-between place. So in analysing the corpus using digital techniques, just focusing on the Philosopher's Stone, the prevalence of spaces designated liminal are very clear, where there are 40 instances of corridors, 10 references to passageways, 14 mentions of paths, and 50 instances of walls, reinforcing this huge period of transition facing Harry. And the progression in space throughout the 7 novels is clear, with additional locations surrounding Hogwarts added into the plot as the texts continue. We very much see Harry's geographic location expanding. So in the Philosopher's Stone, there is only Hogwarts and the Forbidden Forest outside the Muggle world. In the Chamber of Secrets, Harry's world is extended further by discovering the Chamber of Secrets itself and visiting the Burrow for the first time. Then Hogsmeade and the Shrieking Shack are 2 further additions in The Prisoner of Azkaban. The Goblet of Fire transports Harry to the vague location of the Quidditch World Cup and to the graveyard in Little Hangleton. 12 Grimmauld Place and St Mungo's Hospital are revealed in The Order of the Phoenix. The Half-Blood Prince is a veritable mine of new locations, both ahead of and amid the early stages of Harry's quest with Dumbledore, beginning with the superbly named Budley Babberton, Knockturn Alley, the cave hiding the faux Horcrux. There's just a few examples. Then the Deathly Hallows takes Harry, Ron and Hermione to a significant range of new locations, including Godric's Hollow, the Lovegoods House, Malfoy Manor and Shell Cottage. And the Deathly Hallows is the only novel set predominantly outside the Hogwarts castle itself. So when Harry, Ron and Hermione return to the school for the epic Battle of Hogwarts, a great proportion of the action takes place outside the castle. And the symbolic return of the trio to places such as Hogsmeade, the Room of Requirement and the Chamber of Secrets, Shrieking Shack, all in one novel, must be recognised as a key motif returning. So thinking about the technical stuff, Patty and I modified and extended a methodology created by Patty and Naomi Howell at Exeter, adapting the structure and approaches for our purpose here. And that consists of the design of an annotation schema in XML, aiding the extraction of information and exploration of geographic data, among many other topics. So XML, sorry if this is too basic, but it's a markup language that is both readable by humans and by computers. And there are 2 parts in particular that are important in setting the methodologies in place. That's developing the schema and then actually annotating the text. So the software we've been using is Oxygen XML editor, which is a really sophisticated piece of software that allows not only XML annotation, but also the construction of schemas and XPath queries, which come when we want to pull out the data. We had previously tried out Atom as an annotation software, but found that Oxygen was much more versatile and often more reliable as well. Another software I'm using on another piece of work is TagTog, with whom Patty and the DH team at Lancaster have teamed up to explore the capabilities of the system. But with the Harry Potter side of things, I'm going to stick with Oxygen XML. So the schema is essentially a map for everything you want to find in the text, so that when you go through the corpus and you tag words and phrases, every time you tag, it references this guide. So it's basically setting out, it's a menu for everything you want to find. So this is part of the schema I developed for the Harry Potter project. So it's looking at real world correlation, environment, location, building type, threshold type, etc. And the beauty of the schema is that you can update it and change it if any additional thoughts on content arise or if the focus of the project changes. It's not a fixed map for the text. So you can see there's a wide range of categories for annotation here, but it can be as big or as small as the project requires. I must admit, one of the things that I learned quite early on was to not get overexcited and to create an absolutely massive schema with an almost endless set of attributes. That was a useful lesson to learn. So one of the really exciting things with this approach is the ability to carry out extensive co-location analysis. So in addition to just looking at the named entity recognition, you're actually citing things such as emotions and objects within the context of space and place and the text and other attributes. As we know, space doesn't exist on its own, but within this myriad network of significances and related actions. So being able to interrogate these connections will be fantastic. So here we have the branches that are, for example, person, place, or animal, stemming from each element. Almost like branches from a tree really are attributes. These could be gender or role, the person element, or indoor or built environment, a place, which then have response inputs. And there are various different value response formats, basically the answer format in the schema. Some of them are numerical values, some positive or negative, and then there's a free text option, which helps you to mold annotation as you go along. And again, that was a real learning point for me, because I in there, and it quickly got reined in. So it wasn't particularly helpful, as it turned out. So moving on to the annotation, that's the big chunk of the work, going through the corpus and in Oxygen at this stage, manually tagging all of the words and phrases you want to find to teach the computer, and then it will then learn to semi-automatically annotate the text. And one of the things that's really cool about Oxygen is you don't have to just use one word when you're tagging. You can actually grab a phrase, so that's been particularly useful with emotions, because sometimes it doesn't say Harry, felt sad. It'll say Harry felt his heart dropping, for example, and you can tag that. So if in the Harry Potter corpus we're looking for a location that corresponds to a real world location, so that's a real world correlation 1, and it's built up, we would use the schema to first assign the element, in this case place, then the attribute RWC and the value RWC1, and then you can look at the environments, add in built, for example. So this is a screenshot just to kind of show you what it looks like. It's just the first couple of pages of the Philosopher's Stone, and it does look quite distracting, but actually once you get in the swing of it, you can pretty much read the text as you would normally. Then once the annotation's done, the XML editor can then pull out a report that contains all of the instances of all the words and phrases you've tagged and their relations to other tagged words. For example, if we wanted to find every instance of Harry feeling worried while situated in a large natural space. So the huge appeal about engaging fantasy literature in this project is the tantalising vague and fantastical locations and the challenge that this presents to digital and spatial humanities, and in turn how we respond to it and how we actually analyse it. So for our analysis, we put together markers for types of locations within these 4 distinct categories. relating to the correlation with the real world. So real world correlation 1 relates to fully identifiable locations within our primary world, including King's Cross Station. It exists, it's real. 2 cites locations as vague, that these locations are neither categorically real or imaginary. So the hut on the rock early in the Philosopher's Stone would be a location within this category. Number 3 is for imaginary locations, Hogwarts being a prime example, and they don't exist in the primary world, sadly. Then real world correlation 4, this is one of the things we're particularly keen to capture. So it relates to a combination of fantastic and real locations. And this hasn't been looked at elsewhere, so we're quite excited about this. So some locations in Harry Potter traverse the primary and the secondary worlds. So thinking about Diagon Alley, it's a fictional street in the very real city of London. Platform 9 3/4 is an imaginary platform accessed through and within a very real station. Of course, there is a bit of wiggle room with the locations and how specific you want to get and how much prior knowledge you want to assign. So I gave this presentation a while ago and someone came up and said, well, Hogwarts is based on a castle in Scotland, so it is real. Yeah, which is it's a useful thing to think about, but we're thinking about what Hogwarts actually is as opposed to where it is. Going back to the definition of place, it's assigning all these attributes and peopleness side of things rather than just the place. So there's an example at the bottom of the XPath query syntax. So you basically just put in a formula as a query statement and it spits out loads of data like this. Excuse me. So this is a select annotation from the first book. So these are the selection of the real world places. So the first volume contains mentions of 1,011 distinct places. In these, 49 are real places, 597 are vague, 346 are imaginary, and 19 are combined real and imaginary places. And this is a really useful report actually, because it gives you sort of the data itself, the location stuff, which isn't particularly helpful, but then it actually picks out the line and the column. So if you've got a query about something, you can click on it and go back to the editor. So I've got a few data visualizations to show you based on the data. And these are some pretty sexy graphs from this gorgeous data visualization website called Raw Graphs. So map of the real places, real world correlation 1 places, allow us to think of the spatial context that Ronan gave to the first book in terms of the real geographies on figure 4. Within these, as expected, the majority concentrate in the UK and particularly London. All the exciting things happen in London. Moreover, although some of these are of interest in themselves, such as the mention of Blackpool Pier or Dundee, few can be regarded as less expected than the Sahara Desert, Brazil, Romania, and Africa, and can be interesting in terms of the expansion of the imaginative world of the series. And this is obviously something that develops in later novels as well, when we get schools of witchcraft and wizardry from other places and meet more foreign wizards. When visualizing the real world correlation 2 places in terms of the frequency with which they're mentioned, it's really interesting to note that thresholds, or what could be considered these between or liminal spaces, have this real prominence. Events seem to happen consistently in relation to doors, corridors, windows, and halls, but also the library, which is quite interesting, as the library might not be the place that comes foremost to the mind when thinking of the plot of the book. So, as expected, when visualising the imaginary places, Hogwarts comes first. However, places like Gringotts and the Forest also take quite a prominent place. And it will be interesting to see how the mentions of these places in particular evolve in the series. One of the things we do need to look at is consistency. So you'll see that the Forest and then the Forest come up as distinct places, as do Hogwarts, Castle, and less specifically School. So we need to look at a way of combining those, as we know that they're referring to the same place. School's a bit of a weird one, because obviously that can refer to one of the other schools, so Stonewall High, for example, or Smeltings. But yes, that is definitely something to think about. So the action, this is not the clearest thing, but basically this figure is showing indoors action and outdoors action. So the action does seem to take place primarily indoors and along these corridors, rooms, halls, and the library. One of the most prominent places outdoors is the forest, with 22 citations. And this is really interesting due to the connotation of the forest, not only in fantasy series now, but also in other genres such as medieval romance, where the forest is a place where heroes go to test their values and aptitudes. There are a lot of parallels we can draw across the literature and the genres. It's not just within the fantasy itself. So just briefly giving you an idea of people and objects. There are 4,833 instances of person and 1,749 instances of object, of which 791 objects are real, or we define that as known to our world, 813 instances of fantastical objects, and 145 combination objects. So these are things that traverse the primary and the secondary world. They might be known to us as we are now, but are applied in distinctly fantastical ways in Harry Potter. And it is worth emphasising that this is just one volume, so we've got so much data from just the one volume. And with these methods, it's possible to data mine and analyse the entire collection once we've introduced a tool for semi-automatic identification. So having a little reflect on the project as it currently stands. So the learning points are key. So very early on in annotation, I did have to figure out a few positions on annotating, particularly relating to applying prior knowledge, having read all the novels multiple times and coming across instances for the first time. Sorry, ignore that one. So on a couple of examples, I needed to figure out whether I should assign houses in tagging characters from their first reference. So when we first meet, if I then add Gryffindor later on, is it to confuse the computer? So what I did, just for the sake of consistency, rather than having a Ron that exists in Gryffindor and one that exists out of Gryffindor, I did stick the houses in immediately. So this is also a question relating to other characters, such as Fred and George. So a first-time reader at the outset of the Philosopher's Stone would not necessarily know that Fred and George are in Gryffindor, but for the sake of consistency, I added the houses. A slightly more complicated issue is Animagi. So we first meet Professor McGonagall in her cat form, lurking around Privet Drive. With prior knowledge, I know this is McGonagall. So in this instance, I tagged the cat as a cat, without defining whether the cat is real or fantastic, as opposed to defining the cat as a person. This is something that will potentially change. I don't have the answer to it. It's basically just what I've done at the moment. But obviously, Animagi come up a lot more frequently later on with characters like Sirius and Lupin. I'll also need to have a think about consistency in discussing animal forms of people, because not only is it Animagi, but we have werewolves and transfiguration. Yeah, it's all about consistency. It's a fun problem to have. And I think the learning points are definitely going to continue to come thick and fast as we progress through the text. So what next? World domination through fantasy literature mainly. So we have a few tasks ahead of us. So finish the analysis of all 7 books and produce a complete report. By the end of book 2, hopefully we'll be in a place for the computer to carry out some semi-automatic annotations based on the work of the first 2 books. Considering the role of projected spaces, for example, the Mirror of Erised, the Marauder's Map, this is something that only recently came up in conversation, but we need to have a think about projected spaces where actions actually take place within these non-traditional locations. So also address the learning points, find the ways to meet them, ensuring consistency while preserving the text. One of the things I'm particularly interested in as well is exploring differences in the representations of space and place between the novels and the films. We all know that film directors take liberties with some text, and Harry Potter is no exception. And then thinking about translation, I did start working with the Americanized version of the Philosopher's Stone, or the Sorcerer's Stone, as they call it. Again, there are a lot of really interesting comparisons to be made. And it was interesting to note that the American version translated our crumpets into English muffins. But on a serious note, linguistic translations of the text could reveal some really fascinating contrasts, and how space and place are discussed, how what correlations are made and connections within the text. Then looking at publishing the methodology and approaches once it's all tried, tested and approved, and then evaluating essentially what has been our pilot project and move on to some other texts. So on the bottom half of the slide, there's a list of texts that it would be ace to look at. We are keen to avoid a purely British study, so I found some brilliant texts from American, Polish and German authors as well. Also looking at a chronological spread of texts, so we should be able to explore how space and place are represented in fantasy and how it evolves from the 1930s to the present day. This has been a super whistle-stop tour, and I've shoved a lot of stuff in there, so please hit me up with questions or comments. It's still very much under review and in the legwork stages, so any comments and questions will be hugely appreciated. Thank you very much.
Anna, thank you so much. That was really fantastic. Just to get us started with the comments and questions, I think if you go through the chat, Anna, you will see, if you go actually, all the way up, you will see quite a lot of the things that have been talked about during the session. So as I said before, the questions are marked with the word question in the front, but there are also several comments. But I think although they are not questions, I think they are actually worth it for you to have a look at and maybe comment on them, because I think they are really, really good.
Yeah, fab. Okay. There's so much stuff. This is awesome. Okay, question from Sally. Never really understood the difference between space and place. Sally, did that help in talking about the terms that Robert Prusso and Link Meskel mentioned, that space, the physical setting which everything occurs, place is the outcome of the social processes of valuing space? Did that make sense?
It did, thanks. And it's sort of, you answered that about 2 minutes after I'd asked that question. So that was great. Thanks a lot.
Brilliant. Great, thank you. And yes, the literary perspective does rock. I appreciate that. She's also a mind reader. Love it. Oh, data is an uncomfortable term in the humanities. Discuss. Thanks, Sally. That's horrible. Yeah, it's one of those things. Looking at basically how we talk about text, and I think data is a term that's used so much in the STEM side of things that it might not be the most comfortable with bedfellows. That might be a purely subjective thing on my part, just from the people that I've spoken to about it. But yes, it might be uncomfortable. Question from Ben. What would happen if you tried to geolocate Camelot? Would it return to the location of the theme park? I think that's been torn down now. I'm pretty sure it's just gone. I have absolutely no idea, frankly. Yeah, I haven't got a clue. Patty, do you want to deal with your PhD students?
I think basically what it will happen is that, it will point you to Camelot, New York or something like that. And it will be completely, GIS will be completely confused about it. And then, that's something that we cannot necessarily map, unless you have coordinates.
Yeah, very brilliant. A comment from Julia. Guided towards one of the studies mentioned as being an exciting example of extracting. Yes, I can follow up with you, Julia. Thanks very much for your comment about references for that. So I've got a few. I'm sure Patty's got a few that she can share as well. Naomi. Are there issues with these techniques as well as with Unreal and Mapple places? Yes, with places that aren't directly named, only alluded to. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's one of those difficult things. I think Patty's possibly got more experience dealing with places that haven't been directly named but alluded to. Patty, have you got anything on that?
I think that is probably, impossible to do automatically. in a way, I guess you can try to think about it in terms of the semantics, but I will say, I mean, with the techniques that we have developed so far in the spatial humanities, I will say, yeah, no, that is not, yeah, that is not possible yet. Although, you know, there are other projects, of course, such as the one that Sally Bushell runs here at Lancaster University that have also developed really exciting ideas regarding how to, you know, address these places and so on. So it might be worth to have a chat with them too.
Yeah, that sounds good. See, Patty and Joe have sent some links over for Julia. That's awesome. Question from Rihanna. Does the fact that Harry Potter incorporates both real locations such as London as well as fantasy locations make it easier or more difficult to map? I suppose it's more difficult in a sense, because if it was purely real world locations, you'd be able to just use techniques that already exist for tagging and mapping. So this is one of the reasons we came up with the real world correlation analysis approach, because it enables you to use the same approach for the different types of spaces. Does that make sense? I hope so.
It does.
Great, brilliant, thank you. So swinging down. Yeah, Julia, yeah, the platform 9 3/4 does now exist, which complicates things even more. Yeah, that was something else that someone brought up last time I talked about this. Hi, Joe. So what does mapping reveal about the global/local relations in the novels? Are there case-i political implications? How might this work towards reading of the novel through, for example, a post-colonial lens? I'll come back to you once I've got all the data in place, if that's okay. Yeah, it's not something that I've looked at yet. A question from Patty. It says, has your view of the novels been transformed by this work? Yeah, I think it has a little bit. I think it's that usual thing, like you do a PhD in English and you can't read a book without analysing it again. I think because I've been looking at the spaces and places so much in Harry Potter, every time I read it or watch it, so I was watching a bit of the Philosopher's Stone just while I was tweaking my PowerPoint earlier, I'm focusing a lot more on how the spaces are used. And obviously in the film, it's more performance analysis than textual analysis as well. But yeah, no, definitely. Question from Ben. Do you think prominence of thresholds is a symptom of the action mainly taking place in the castle? Or might it be a marker of how the author likes to write scenes? Yes and yes, potentially. One of the things that we do just need to be careful about is thinking about Roland Barthes and how the author is dead. So kind of ascribing any significance to how the author might like to write the scenes is tricky. But yeah, it could be a symptom of the action mainly taking place in the castle, and it's something that have made a note of to look at as the action develops more outside the castle as well, and how it varies. Oh, final comment from Naomi. Regarding the changing status of characters, as more information is given, maybe there needs to be an extra dimension of time in terms of where in the novel that the information is tracked against. Yeah, that is super cool. I have no idea if it's possible either, but it sounds awesome. Oh, got a thumbs up from Ben for doing it for The Witcher. You're happy to help. Great, I will take you up on that. Oh, got some insight into English muffins in the US. Thanks, Tamsin. Any issues with copyright? Yeah, this is an interesting thing, because you can basically, one of the things I wanted to do very early on when I was still completely new to DH stuff, not that I'm an old hand now, but is looking at whether I could publish an annotated copy of the text, and quickly learned, yeah, you can't do that. However, you can process, you can publish the results of them, so you kind of get around the copyright issues there. Have you found the experience of using a semi-automated methodology? Yeah, the methodology has been great. It's worked really well. The schema was definitely something to get my head around, and I was looking at Annette's question as well about formulating the schema. It wasn't particularly difficult. It was, yeah, I mean, I suppose it was difficult in the sense of trying to pin down everything that I wanted to look at and not miss anything out. But I think the fact that you can amend it as you go along as well made it a bit easier. And Oxygen XML editor makes it quite easy to pull a schema together too. Must admit, in the early days when we were putting the schema together, it was hosted, it was when Patty and I were at Chester, and it was hosted on the DH Centre's website. So it was separate to the software that we were using at the time, which was Atom. And because it's integrated in Oxygen, it's a lot easier. But yeah, I was basically creating a schema on an Excel spreadsheet and sending it to Patty, and she was doing her magic on it. Question from Tamsin: read about other projects using XML encoding for machine learning. How does it work? What program do you feed the XML into? I haven't started on the automatic recognition yet, Tamsin. I think Patty would probably be best placed, or Paul Raisin. I think Paul Raisin's on here as well. So yeah, a question about feeding the XML to generate the automatic recognition. You'd love to learn if anyone wants to do a workshop. Me too, basically. Yeah, I definitely have a chat with Patty on that. Another question for Tamsin: do you think J.K. Rowling intentionally put a lot of action into liminal places? Author is still dead, so yeah, I try not to think about the kind of intentional stuff, but I think it's quite telling that it seems to be quite a consistent feature of the first novel. And you know, going through the novels, actually there are quite a few liminal spaces as you kind of go through the series. I like to think it's representing sort of Harry's new journey, but who knows. Comment from Rihanna: oh, thanks for sending me a comparison reference. That's ace. That's why I left literature of cultural studies about Bart. Love it. I think that's from Pedro. Just build methodology from scratch or follow expanded existing projects methods. So took some inspiration from the project that Patty and Naomi Howell-Exeter did on medieval romances, and obviously I had Patty on hand as my kind of guru for that. So we did base it on there, and I was a complete newbie at the time. So that answers your question, Pedro.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, thanks for that.
Brilliant. I love your comment, Sally. Did choose my "We All Read Dead People" mug for today's Hangout. That's quite fun. Yeah, it's an interesting one. I'm not so sure it's so much about removing literature from its cultural context, but trying to remove the author's intentions without removing the cultural context, because I agree that is super important. Yes. Okay. Bye, Rihanna. Thank you so much. Has anyone else got anything else? I think I've reached the end of the questions there. Thanks, Naomi.
Is there anything else that you want to ask Anna before we just give the last part? Yeah, okay, great. Yeah, so that's really fantastic. Thank you guys for, oh yeah, go on, Shona, ask whatever you want.
Yeah, got it.
Oh.
Can you guess which Hogwarts house I would want to be in?
Slytherin.
Oh, no! Patty, I thought you knew me.
I'm insulting you.
Obviously. Oh, another question from Sally. Say something about projected space. Yeah, this is a super cool thing. So, Sally, have you watched or read Harry Potter? Can I just check?
Sorry, lost my mute. Yes, I read the books, but the movies were too scary for me.
Oh, okay, fair dues. Yeah, so you'll know in the books that Harry basically gets sucked into the Pensieve, which To be honest, if I could invent anything from fiction, it would be that, because it sounds like the best idea. Taking your thoughts out of your head, putting them in the Ponsieve and coming back to them later. But yeah, so Harry gets sucked into, it's the wizard court at, I think, was it Karkaroff's trial was one of them. But you get these spaces that are created out of absolutely nothing. So you've got the space of the courtroom in the Ponsieve, so it's not really a real space, it's kind of projected out of the Ponsieve. Then you've got things like the dream, so when Harry goes into Voldemort's head and he's seeing what Voldemort's seeing. Yeah, does that make sense? So the kind of spaces that don't actually exist, but they exist through something else. Yeah, it does sound a bit Kafka, sorry about that.
That's not a bad thing.
Love it. But yeah, it's a super cool thing. It's just the way that space is created from so many different ways. I think it's really cool. Yes, dream spaces, Naomi. Yeah. So yes, yeah. I'm just trying to remember. Goblet of Fire. So Harry sees all the stuff that goes on with the Muggle caretaker and Voldemort coming back in his dream. So yeah, again, that's kind of the. It's really weird actually, because it's kind of a projected space that doesn't really exist, but it does exist, and then we come back to it later on, which is quite cool. Yeah, it's a bit random. Oh, bye, Ellery. Thank you so much. Yeah, does that make sense, Naomi? Hopefully. Yeah, think about ones that don't really exist. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah, so dreams about places that don't exist. Yeah. Yeah, so I suppose it's about whether we need to look at projected spaces as having kind of a real world correlation without being a real world correlation as well. So yeah, whether the dream relates to an actual space that really exists, or whether it relates to a fantasy space or a completely fantastical fantasy space that doesn't exist in the fantasy world. The problem is you start going down the rabbit hole and then you just keep digging and you start thinking, I have no idea what space is real anymore and what isn't.
It's a bit of an inception kind of thing, isn't it? Because I mean, within a dream, exactly what Joe is just said. Yeah. You know, whenever you are dreaming a place that actually exists. So what happens with that? That's a really good question.
Yeah, Naomi. Yeah, like the Dumbledore at the train station thing. Yeah. Because it's kind of King's Cross, it's kind of alluded to as maybe being King's Cross. And then Dumbledore says to Harry, well, you know, it's your dream. I don't really know where we are. Yes, as Paul says, hi, Paul, I knew you were there. Just because it's in your head doesn't mean it's not real. Yeah, I think we're going into a fun place right now. I love it. Have you looked at reconstructing space through gaming engines? No, but it sounds cool. It's not something I know about. Sally, thank you for that. You've got ace questions. Pedro thought about visually representing these spaces, which may or may not be geolocated. Yeah. Not yet is the quick answer to that, Pedro. It is something that's kind of on my radar at the moment, because I'm looking at putting in a bid for Being Human project this year with some colleagues at Lancaster, and looking at creating potentially some physical artifacts relating to new worlds or alternative worlds or fantasy worlds, and using those as a kind of inspiration for discussions about things. So Patty's just put the link in for Sally Bushell's project, Chronotopic Cartographies, and that's visually representing the spaces through Minecraft. I don't know if you're acquainted with that, but it is super awesome. It's a really, really cool thing.
Fantastic, thanks.
Oh, thank you, Shona. That's really kind of you. Thanks so much. I don't know much either.
Right. Okay. So I think we have reached the end of the questions. But thank you very much for coming and for staying with us during the Digital Humanities Hangouts. As said before, next session will be at 3 p.m. UK time, and we will announce the next sessions as well in Twitter and the regular means through, email list and so on. So thank you so much for everything again, and I hope to see you soon. Anna, thank you so much for the brilliant talk, and have a good weekend, you all.
Thanks so much, everyone. It's been great talking to you. Thank you all so much.